Welcome back to Churchill's Secret Diary. This is episode 6, and if you've been following this series, you know the host has uncovered some incredible secrets about Winston Churchill's private struggles. But what you're about to hear might be the most shocking entry yet, because it reveals 3 hours when Churchill believed that everything he had fought for was lost forever. This diary entry is dated November 23, 1942, and it begins with words that show how close the Allied cause came to complete collapse. At 2:47 p.m. today, Churchill received intelligence that convinced him World War II was over and democracy had lost. For 3 hours and 12 minutes, he believed that Hitler had outmaneuvered them so completely that surrender was their only option. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life, and he had never been more grateful to be wrong. Nobody knew that Winston Churchill spent 3 hours on November 23, 1942, drafting Britain's surrender terms to Nazi Germany. While the world saw him as the unshakable voice of Allied determination, Churchill was secretly preparing to end the war on Hitler's terms because he believed a catastrophic intelligence failure had made victory impossible. The crisis began with a decoded German message that seemed to reveal the most devastating betrayal in military history. According to The Intercept, Stalin had secretly agreed to a separate peace with Hitler, and Soviet forces were preparing to switch sides and join Germany in a final assault on Britain and America. If true, this intelligence meant that the entire Allied strategy was based on a lie, and continued resistance would result in the complete annihilation of the Western democracies. Churchill's diary reveals his immediate reaction to this news. If Stalin has betrayed us, then everything Churchill had planned, every sacrifice he had asked people to make, every promise he had given about ultimate victory becomes meaningless. Britain wasn't fighting a two-front war anymore. They were fighting a war against the entire continent of Europe, backed by Soviet resources and manpower. Mathematics didn't lie. They could not win. The intelligence seemed credible because it came through Ultra, the same decoding system that had given Britain accurate German communications throughout the war. The message appeared to be from Hitler directly to his field commanders, outlining the terms of the Soviet alliance and the timeline for joint operations against Britain and America. Every technical analysis suggested the message was genuine. But what made the intelligence even more terrifying was that it explained several recent military developments that had puzzled Allied commanders. Soviet offensives had slowed unexpectedly, German forces had been repositioned in ways that didn't make sense if they were still fighting Russia, and diplomatic contacts between Moscow and Berlin had increased dramatically. Everything seemed to confirm that Stalin had made a deal with Hitler. Churchill's diary records the exact moment when he realized the full implications. If Stalin joins Hitler, the war becomes unwinnable immediately. Britain would be facing German industrial capacity, Soviet manpower, and combined military expertise that no allies of Britain and America could match. Every day they continued fighting after today would just increase the casualty count without changing the inevitable outcome. The prospect of inevitable defeat forced Churchill to confront the most painful decision of his career. Should he continue fighting a hopeless war and watch millions more people die, or should he negotiate surrender while some terms might still be possible? His diary reveals that for the first time since becoming Prime Minister, Churchill seriously considered that capitulation might be the moral choice. How many young men should die for Churchill's pride? How many cities should be destroyed for his refusal to face reality? If they were going to lose anyway, wasn't it better to lose now while Britain still existed, rather than later when it had been bombed into rubble? Churchill's diary shows that he spent the next 2 hours doing something he had never done before, calculating the terms under which Britain might acceptably surrender to Nazi Germany. The entries reveal a man trying to salvage whatever dignity and independence might be possible in defeat. If you want to know how Churchill prepared for surrender and what saved him from making the biggest mistake in military history, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next proves that sometimes the most important intelligence is the intelligence that turns out to be wrong.
Churchill's surrender calculations were methodical and heartbreaking. His diary reveals that he spent over an hour drafting terms that might preserve some semblance of British independence under Nazi occupation, knowing that any negotiation would require him to abandon everything he had promised the British people about never giving up. Churchill was trying to figure out what pieces of Britain might survive if they surrendered now versus what would be left if they fought to total defeat. Could they negotiate to keep the Royal Navy? Could they maintain some form of parliamentary government under German supervision? Could they protect the Commonwealth from complete Nazi control? These were the questions no prime minister should ever have to ask, but Stalin's betrayal had made them unavoidable. The most devastating part of Churchill's surrender planning was his realization that capitulation would vindicate every critic who had called him a warmonger and a fool. His diary reveals his growing awareness that his entire political legacy would be defined by this moment of defeat. History will remember Churchill as the man who promised Britain would never surrender, and then surrendered anyway. Every speech he had given about British courage and determination would be replayed as evidence of his delusion and arrogance. He would go down as the leader who inspired false hope and then crushed it with reality. But Churchill's diary also reveals his growing suspicion that something about the German intelligence didn't make sense. Despite the technical authenticity of the message, certain details seemed inconsistent with what he knew about both Stalin and Hitler's strategic thinking. Stalin may be ruthless and paranoid, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that any alliance with Hitler would be temporary and that Germany would eventually turn on Russia regardless of any agreements. Why would Stalin trade certain German betrayal later for uncertain German victory now? And why would Hitler, who had always seen communism as his ultimate enemy, trust Stalin enough to make a real alliance? These doubts led Churchill to order additional verification of the intelligence, but the process would take hours, and every minute of delay made the military situation potentially worse. If the Soviet betrayal was real, then every hour spent checking and double-checking the intelligence was an hour that should be spent preparing for immediate surrender negotiations. Churchill's diary reveals the psychological torture of this dilemma. Churchill had to decide whether to surrender based on intelligence that might be wrong or continue fighting based on hope that might be false. Either choice could result in disaster, and he wouldn't know which choice was correct until it was too late to change his mind. The pressure became almost unbearable when Churchill received reports that German forces were beginning unusual movements that seemed to confirm the intelligence about Soviet alliance. Enemy divisions were being repositioned, supply lines were being reorganized, and diplomatic communications between Berlin and Moscow were increasing hourly. Churchill wrote, "Every piece of new information seemed to confirm his worst fears. The Germans were acting like men who had just received guarantees that their Eastern Front was secure. If he was wrong about Stalin's betrayal, he was making plans to surrender unnecessarily. If he was right about Stalin's betrayal, he was wasting precious time that could be spent negotiating better terms." The breaking point came when Churchill's military advisors presented him with casualty projections for continued fighting against a German-Soviet alliance. The numbers were so devastating that even Churchill's most aggressive commanders recommended immediate peace negotiations.
General Brooke estimated that they could sustain organized resistance for perhaps 6 weeks against combined German-Soviet forces, at the cost of losing their entire army, their remaining air force, and probably London itself. After that, they would be in no position to negotiate anything. They would simply be accepting whatever terms Hitler chose to offer. Churchill's diary reveals that at 4:23 p.m., he made the decision to authorize preliminary surrender negotiations through Swiss diplomatic channels. He was prepared to sacrifice his own legacy and reputation to save what remained of Britain and the British people. But then, at exactly 4:31 p.m., Churchill received a phone call that changed everything and revealed that the most dangerous intelligence failure of World War II was about to become the most fortunate intelligence failure in history. Subscribe and hit that notification bell to find out what saved Churchill from surrender and how one single phone call changed the course of the war.
The phone call that saved World War II came from an unexpected source, Bletchley Park's chief cryptographer, who had discovered a critical error in the German message that changed everything. Churchill's diary records the exact conversation that transformed his darkest moment into one of his greatest strategic insights. The cryptographer's voice was shaking as he told Churchill, "Prime Minister, we've found the problem with the German message. It's not fake, but it's not real either. It's what we call a deception test. The Germans are sending false intelligence through channels they know we can decode to see how we react. They're not reporting Stalin's betrayal, they're trying to trick us into believing Stalin has betrayed us." Churchill's immediate reaction reveals how close he had come to falling into Hitler's trap. Churchill realized that he had spent 3 hours doing exactly what Hitler wanted him to do, losing faith in their allies, calculating surrender terms, and preparing to abandon the fight just when they were beginning to gain the upper hand. The most sophisticated German deception of the war had nearly worked perfectly. But Churchill's diary also reveals his growing appreciation for the brilliance of the German psychological warfare. Hitler had understood that the most effective way to defeat Churchill wasn't through military pressure, but through undermining his confidence in the Allied coalition. Hitler knew that their greatest strength was their alliance with Stalin, so he was trying to destroy that alliance through deception rather than force. If he could convince them that Stalin had betrayed them, they might surrender voluntarily, saving Hitler the cost and risk of actually defeating them militarily. It was diabolical, but Churchill had to admire the strategic thinking. The revelation that the Soviet betrayal was fictional immediately transformed Churchill's understanding of the entire war situation. If Germany was resorting to elaborate deception campaigns, it suggested that they were weaker than they appeared, and more desperate than their propaganda indicated. Churchill wrote, "Confident armies don't need to trick their enemies into surrendering. The fact that Hitler was trying to win through deception rather than direct confrontation told Churchill that he wasn't as strong as he wanted them to believe. This intelligence failure may have revealed more about German weakness than months of conventional military intelligence." But Churchill's diary also reveals his profound embarrassment at how completely he had been deceived. For 3 hours, the man who was supposed to be the strategic genius of the Allied cause had been planning surrender based on fictional intelligence. Churchill prided himself on his ability to see through enemy propaganda and analyze situations objectively, but Hitler's deception worked perfectly on him. He was so terrified of being outmaneuvered that he fell for a manipulation designed specifically to exploit that fear. The Germans studied his psychology and used it against him with devastating effectiveness. The experience taught Churchill something crucial about leadership during wartime. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one attacking your positions, but the one attacking your confidence in your own judgment. Hitler's greatest weapon wasn't the Wehrmacht or the Luftwaffe. It was Churchill's own tendency toward self-doubt and worst-case scenario thinking.
Churchill's diary reveals how he used this insight to strengthen his leadership for the rest of the war. Churchill realized that his job wasn't just to make good strategic decisions. His job was to maintain confidence in their ability to make good strategic decisions, even when they were operating with incomplete information and facing psychological pressure designed to undermine that confidence. But the most important lesson Churchill learned from his 3 hours of despair wasn't about military strategy. It was about the relationship between hope and leadership. His diary reveals that the experience fundamentally changed his approach to inspiring others during crisis. Churchill used to think that hope was something you offered to other people when you felt confident about the outcome. But he had learned that hope was something you chose to maintain when you had no idea what the outcome would be. The British people didn't need a leader who was never afraid. They needed a leader who chose courage despite fear. Churchill's diary also reveals how the false intelligence crisis affected his relationship with Stalin. Instead of weakening their alliance, the German deception attempt actually strengthened Churchill's appreciation for the Soviet contribution to the war effort. Spending 3 hours believing that Stalin had betrayed them made Churchill realize how much they depended on Soviet resistance to German forces. When he thought they had lost Stalin as an ally, he immediately understood how valuable he actually was. Sometimes you don't appreciate what you have until you think you've lost it. But Churchill's diary reveals one more crucial insight from his 3 hours of despair that would influence Allied strategy for the rest of the war.
Churchill's final insight from his 3 hours of false despair revolutionized his understanding of psychological warfare and became one of the most important strategic principles of the Allied victory. His diary reveals that the German deception attempt had actually taught him how to use similar tactics against Hitler. If the Germans could shake Churchill's confidence with false intelligence about Soviet betrayal, then they could shake German confidence with false intelligence about Allied capabilities and intentions. The most powerful weapon in modern warfare wasn't tanks or planes. It was the enemy's imagination working against them. This realization led Churchill to authorize a massive expansion of Allied deception operations, designed to make Hitler as paranoid and uncertain as Churchill had been during those 3 critical hours. The false intelligence campaigns that helped ensure D-Day's success can be traced directly back to Churchill's experience of being deceived on November 23, 1942. Churchill wrote, "Churchill was going to make Hitler spend his own 3 hours believing that his situation was hopeless, his allies had betrayed him, and his only option was surrender. If psychological pressure could work on Churchill, it could work on anyone, including the man who invented it." But Churchill's diary also reveals the lasting personal impact of his brief loss of faith. The experience had shown him how quickly confidence could collapse under pressure, and how important it was to build psychological resilience into Allied planning and leadership. Churchill now understood that winning this war required more than military superiority. It required the ability to maintain hope and determination, even when everything seemed lost. The Germans tried to defeat him by making him defeat himself, and they almost succeeded. He couldn't let that happen again, to himself or to anyone under his command. Churchill's diary reveals that he instituted new protocols for verifying critical intelligence, specifically designed to prevent future deception operations from having such devastating psychological effects. But more importantly, he began sharing his experience with other Allied leaders, teaching them to recognize and resist psychological manipulation. Churchill told Roosevelt and Stalin about his 3 hours of despair, not to embarrass himself, but to prepare them for similar attacks on their confidence and judgment. Hitler's greatest weapon was their tendency to doubt themselves and each other. The best defense against that weapon was honest communication about their fears and vulnerabilities. The German deception attempt also taught Churchill about the importance of maintaining perspective during crises. His diary reveals that he began scheduling regular reality checks with trusted advisors, specifically designed to counter the effects of enemy psychological warfare. Churchill had learned that when you're under extreme pressure, your judgment becomes unreliable. But you don't realize it's unreliable. The solution wasn't to make decisions alone. It was to build systems that forced you to test your reasoning against other perspectives before taking irreversible actions. Churchill's most profound reflection on his 3 hours of false despair came in a diary entry written on VE Day 1945. November 23, 1942, was the day Churchill learned that the war could be lost, not through military defeat, but through psychological surrender. Hitler tried to convince him that resistance was hopeless, and for 3 hours he succeeded. But those 3 hours taught him that hope isn't a feeling, it's a decision, and the most important battles are fought in the mind before they're fought on the battlefield. The experience also strengthened Churchill's appreciation for the people around him who had helped him recognize and correct his error. His diary reveals newfound respect for the intelligence analysts, cryptographers, and advisors whose expertise had saved him from making the greatest mistake of his career. Churchill used to think that leadership meant making decisions independently and taking full responsibility for the consequences. But he had learned that leadership meant building teams of people who could save you from your own worst impulses and help you think clearly when pressure made clear thinking almost impossible. Churchill kept a copy of the false German intelligence on his desk for the rest of the war, not as a reminder of his failure, but as a reminder of how close he had come to giving Hitler exactly what he wanted. The document became a symbol of the psychological dimension of warfare that most military leaders never fully understand. The 3 hours Churchill thought he lost World War II actually taught him how to win it, by showing him that the most important battlefield isn't geographic, it's psychological. Hitler's attempt to break Churchill's spirit through deception ultimately strengthened Churchill's understanding of how hope and despair function in warfare, and that understanding became one of the foundations of Allied victory. That's the end of Episode 6 of Churchill's Secret Diary. What do you think about Churchill's 3 hours of despair? Have you ever had moments when everything seemed lost, only to discover that your perspective was wrong? Let us know in the comments below. If you're enjoying these secrets from Churchill's hidden diary, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next episode, the host will uncover Churchill's secret plan to fake his own death, a story of deception and survival that sounds like something from a spy novel. Which episode from Churchill's diary do you want to hear next? Comment your choice, and don't forget to like this video if you're learning something new about the psychological side of wartime leadership.